we are Bill.com, and is any, okay, I can do this. This is our team. So we have Yashan over there, Sabrina, Sean, Jahao, Parth, Sakshi, Brian, Aidana, Stavan, and myself, Han. And our agenda for today will be, I will go over the company background and also talk about the scope and how it's changed over the last 2 quarters. Then I'll also talk about the data that was provided to us before handing it over to Brian to talk about the exploratory data analysis. And then Parth will run over the insights and graph visualizations. And then finally, Sakshi will give you our recommendations to Bill.com and the leading signals that further validate those recommendations. So a brief overview of Bill.com. They're a financial software company that provides accounting, invoicing, and payment services. They serve mainly small to medium-sized businesses across all 50 states, and they've recently expanded internationally. So scope of the project, in the first winter quarter, we were given the task to hunt revenue, which essentially was identifying the top growing industries that brought the most revenue to Bill.com. Moving into spring quarter, they decided to explore more on COVID impact on the industries they service. So we had to identify who died, who thrived, and who survived. So I think someone mentioned that they had the largest data set, but actually I think we crashed so much that Strom had to buy a new laptop. But also, our data was very sensitive because it was people's transactional information, so we had to do it all locally, and that also caused a bit of a problem. But initially, we had a 10.5 million transactions, and then that was expanded to around 16 million in spring quarter, and that covered $63 billion worth of transaction value across all 25 industries that Bill.com serves. The initial data set was from 2015 to 2019. And then 2019 to 2021 in spring quarter to cover the pandemic. So here are some of the tools we use, Gephi and I think GraphXR, as well as Neo4j are graph databases, and then SQLite and DB browser and Python were used for ETL, and then Tableau was used for the analysis. Moving on to Brian.
Thanks, Tom. So for exploratory data analysis, we use 2 main tools, Tableau as well as TabPy, which is an extension of Tableau, which allowed us to integrate Python coding into our Tableau visualizations. As part of exploratory data analysis, one of our primary purposes was to look based on an industry basis, which industries we can find that are very promising and have a lot of growth potential, and even look into more deeply using graph databases to look into potential customer and vendor interactions and how they can grow us through there as well. So one of our first visualizations we began with was of a bubble chart between the behavior of transactional volume, the number of transactions of each industry, which is represented by the color of the bubbles, versus the size of the bubble, which represents the total aggregate dollar amount of each industry's worth of transactions. So from this visualization, we're able to observe 2 things. From the top of the map, we can first see which of the industries are really prominent. In this case, we can see the tech industry, healthcare industry, and even retail trade. So in the case of making recommendations to Bill.com, if some of the industries that we research have high growth potential happen to be some of these larger industries as well, that would be much more profitable for Bill.com to pursue after compared to similar growth potential industries that may not be as large of a scale. The second thing we can observe from this is that interaction between that, as I was saying, the transaction volume versus transaction amount. When we were looking solely at one metric, for example, maybe just the aggregate transaction amount in dollars, that might not capture the entire scale or the entire scope of each industry, as industries we noticed varied by transaction volume or even the mean or median transaction dollar per amount, transaction amount per amount of transaction. So using this bubble chart, we're able to observe a couple of those things. Our next step that we wanted to do using Tableau was to be able to make forecasting models. And so first we used exponential time smoothing, which was through Tableau. And just by seeing each of the industries, we're able to create a 95% confidence interval forecasting 1 year into 2022. And this was able to also just, picking back from the previous slide, just we were able to see some of the prominent industries, for example, as I was saying, tech, retail, and healthcare, that we were able to really see that these did have promising forecastings going into the year 2022. On top of that, we use this visualization to be able to see which of the industries are also not as prominent or were on much smaller scale that we may not recommend. And using this visualization, we were able to look into specific details about them. So we wanted to reaffirm and dive deeper into these forecasting models. So this is where we started to use TabPy, and using TabPy, we were able to create seasonal ARIMA modeling to create, which was, we felt, much more robust of a time series forecasting model. And so using four of the industries, in this case, the tech, healthcare, retail, and finance, we took a deeper dive into that. And you can see with each of the visualizations that there are two lines. The bottom line, which is the gray line, represents the real data based on transaction. And the orange line, which is above that, is the predicted values based on the real data. And then you can see there's a dashed line, and beyond that we have our out-of-sample forecasting based on the data going into the year 2022. And through this, and just compared to our previous, we were able to confirm that yes, that these were some industries that had high growth potential and that we can confidently recommend to Bill.com as a result. Our next visualization is by aggregating on a daily basis the dollar amount of every day. We were able to plot over that moving average to create a timeline essentially from 2015 all the way through the year 2021. As we were able to have data pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic, we were able to observe the behavior and effects of COVID events on this timeline. As we can see prior to 2020, that the trend line tended to be very stable, but once we saw that where the COVID pandemic happened and even the lockdown period, that there was more erratic behavior. And so to look into this more deeply, we integrated a web data connector, where you can see here a demo. The purpose of the web data connector is to be able to integrate links into every single data point. And by doing so, we can connect relevant articles on major events that happen on each and every single day of these events. And so what this offers to us is a lot of explainability and leading signals. And so when we look at the timeline, we can understand what happened during these specific days that may cause those peaks and those certain dips in our timeline. So that is it for the demo, and next I will pass it on to Parth, who will go over his insights on graph databases.
Thank you, Brian. So we use graph database particularly to validate the insights which Brian was talking about using Tableau, and we further wanted to visualize everything using the graph database. So these were the three tools like Han mentioned which we particularly used. This particular graph was created using the vendor counts in different industries. This particular use case for these graphs was to actually understand from the start of the COVID point, which was Jan 2020 provided by Bill.com, how were industries actually getting affected from that point onwards? How was the count of the vendors increasing or decreasing? And we found there were some which had a high positive impact, while there were some which had a negative impact. You can see like the industries grew back like in the negative impact as well, but we just wanted to see how the curve switched after that particular point. So with the positive COVID impact, we can see the tech, healthcare, and the constructions were the ones which had a high positive impact, while in the COVID negative impact, we can see real estate, restaurants, and print media were the ones which had a negative impact. They eventually grew back, but they had a negative impact from COVID. So this can help Bill.com better understand if a situation like COVID happens again, which industries should they go after and which they should not. These were the particular tools which we used for the graph visualization, which will be presented ahead. Neo4j was the base database, graph database tool which we use. The main advantage of Neo4j is it's compatible with a lot of other tools and it has a lot of additional plugins available. But when it just comes to Neo4j itself, it is very limited with the visualizations present inside. We experienced Neo4j Bloom and NeoVis.js as well, but they were too complex and did not solve our problem statement. That is why we used Gephi to show the time series animation, and we used GraphXR to show like a 3D static relationship of these graphs. This is what a GraphXR graph looks like. It's pretty, isn't it? So you can see like the center red node which is present, that's the particular industry. The orange node which is present, which is displayed as the sender ID, that's what we used in context as the vendor, and the blue, light blue dots which are present, those are written as the receiver ID, but in context it's the customer. This video shows the power of GraphXR, how in 3D you can see, and you can see particular nodes have bigger sizes. those correspond to the amount that they have inside them. And using this visually, we can see how much quickly we can just see the relationships. So this particular graph was for the professional, scientific and technical services, and the vendors and the receivers have particular fields present inside them. And for this particular industry, we even observed there was a many vendor to a particular customer relationship present, which was very unique in this particular industry. Further on, I would like to take you through a Gephi demo, which will show how the mining industry had a big impact of COVID. You can see the timeline moving, and from the point of 2019 onwards, you will see a big drop in the blue dots. And this is because the customers eventually reduced, and that is why the vendors died out. And the COVID had a big impact on mining, coming back to Brian's point. So you can see this very clearly in this particular demo. Further on, this was all of the insights we were able to gather from all of the analysis we did. We found many industries which had a top growing potential. We found industries which had a positive impact from COVID and a negative impact from COVID. We found similarities in the professional, scientific and technical services industry and the healthcare and in the healthcare industry, where they were both present in the top growth potential as well as the top positive COVID impacts. And there were many industries like real estate, mining, which suffered major losses because of it. Now I would like to pass it on to Sakshi to further validate these insights and give recommendations.
Thanks, Parth. So for our recommendations, we combined the findings from Tableau T and the Graph DBT. We wanted to make our findings based on the total amount of transactions and also the frequency of the customer and vendor transactions. So, for our first recommendation, we wanted to find out the industries that thrived irrespective of COVID pandemic. So we want now Bill.com to go ahead with these three industries and find similar profiles. So first one is professional and technical services, second is healthcare, and third is retail. For the first one, as you can see on the right, as per our data set, even the transaction amounts were increasing irrespective of the COVID pandemic, it recovered. And the same was validated to us by Grant Thornton, where we found a news which stated that irrespective of the pandemic, tech services grew tremendously. For our next one, which is healthcare, though we can see that in 2019 there was already an upward trend, but pandemic led to an exponential increase in this industry. And that was verified to us by US Bureau of Statistics, the results. The last one, retail. Though over here we can see that there's a decline during the pandemic time, but we also found that in retail industry, most of them wanted to convert their offline businesses to online businesses, which led to an e-commerce era set it up. Now, this one is a very interesting one. We have a contra recommendation for Bill.com. Though we know that restaurants and accommodation had a $125 billion loss during COVID pandemic, but Bill.com targets small businesses, and we want them to go ahead with restaurants, because even in our data set, it suggests that the total amount is eventually increasing with Bill.com. For our last recommendation, where we do not want Bill.com to go ahead and do any transactions further or work on customer profiles, they should reduce with first mining and quarry, which was also showed by my friend with the graph with the Gephi representation, which was also referred to us by, as you can see the news there, it also validates that. The last one is the information sector. With this information sector, we mean printing media, newspaper and magazines. Since printing media got banned, they cannot run industries to print the same, their customers ultimately declined, which was also the result of COVID pandemic and seen proven by our data set. Now, in last, I would just want to thank the entire Bill.com team who mentored us across 6 months and was ready to take up our experimentations, and the program office team for giving us the opportunity to work with Bill.com, and my amazing team for an amazing teamwork of 6 months. And yeah, color coordinating today with Bill.com colors. Thank you.